Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Well, it's a real pleasure to see this many people gathered in one room who care about the future of women at work. We're off to an encouraging start and a lively session. Welcome. I'm Michele Mulford-Morris. I'm the Vice President for Girls and Women's Strategy at the United Nations Foundation, and I'm delighted to host you here today with the McKinsey Global Institute. And on behalf of us, we are thrilled to see your interest in this report. So I was thinking this morning, we don't ask women often enough what they want, and then we usually, when we do, we fail to hear what they say, and then we then often don't act on it. But when we do ask what women want, we hear over and over again that they want safe, secure, dignified, consistent employment. And our task today is to explore how to deliver that, and in a context where the barriers to entry are impossibly high and work is continuing to evolve. The meaning of work is continuing to evolve at a really rapid pace. So to get us started, it's my pleasure to introduce two women who have dedicated their expertise to some of the most foundational research we have on what allows women to participate and to have agency and success in the world of work. Mikela Krishnan is a senior fellow at the McKinsey Global Institute, and she is an author of the blockbuster Power of Parity report that I imagine many of you remember, released in 2015. And she also provided research on the UN high-level panel's Women's Economic Empowerment report, which I think a lot of us consider our handbook and one of our most kind of indispensable doctrines. She is also on the fund for the Global Fund for Women. And she's going to be joined by Quaylen Illengrud, who's a senior partner at McKinsey, and who is also an author of Power of Parity. So we have a power duo on the Power of Parity. And she's also a member of McKinsey Global Institute's council. So they are going to share with you this morning, this afternoon, this very meaningful and new research that we have that should inform our work and help us act when we ask women what they want and when we dare to listen. Thank you.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. So one thing Michele didn't mention is in my past life, I used to be a PhD student many, many moons ago, and I frequently gave conference presentations that were extremely sparsely attended. So this is fabulous. She also referred to our work as blockbuster, which was never how my academic research was defined. So this is great. But as Michele said, what I would like to do along with Quaylen is to share some of the highlights of the research that we at the McKinsey Global Institute, MGI, have been doing over the past years on gender equality, both in the workplace as well as in society more broadly. And the title of this session is quite broad, right? We're talking about advancing women in the workplace today as well as in the future. And so we want to talk about two different themes of research that we've been driving. What are the challenges that women face today? And what are additional new challenges that could evolve in the coming years? So we want to spend maybe 5 or 10 minutes just giving a brief overview of some of the highlights of our research to help sort of get us all into the right frame for the fabulous panel discussion that we have coming up. But before I do that, why do we care about this issue? So we care about this issue because it is the right thing to do. We also care about this issue because it is the smart thing to do. So MGI in 2015 published the Power of Parity research that found that advancing gender equality globally could add $12 trillion to global GDP in 2025. That's essentially equivalent to adding countries the size of the UK, Germany, and Japan to global GDP in 2025. That's a huge economic opportunity. It's also a huge opportunity for inclusive economic growth, so lifting all boats. So remember that investing in women and girls, not just the right thing to do, but also the smart thing to do. But now let's talk about some of the old challenges. Where do we stand today? One of the things we looked at in a new piece of research we actually just launched yesterday at Women Deliver. It's available online at mckinsey.com/future of women at work. I'm looking at Rebecca to check that I've got that right. Okay, mckinsey.com/future of women at work. One of the things we did in that piece of research is to say, where are we? Since 2015, we signed, the 193 member nations of the UN signed the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. Where are we today, 2019, 4 years into that journey? We looked at two aspects of gender equality, what we call gender equality in society and what we call gender equality in work. And we crafted a score that ranged from 0 to 1, 0 being full inequality, 1 being absolute equality. And what we found from that work was that essentially we've made no progress since 2015. Gender equality both in work and in society has essentially gone up in that, remember that 0 to 1 score, it's gone up by 0.01. And that's the same when we look across countries, across regions. So while we have this huge economic prize, we really haven't made much progress towards that prize. So women are lagging both when it comes to things like their participation in the world of work, but also dimensions related to what we call gender equality in society, which is things like their digital and financial inclusion, their access to education, violence against women, child marriage. And we know the two go hand in hand. Advancing women's gender equality in society is crucial to their advancement in the world of work. And now there's a huge disruption coming. So let's talk about the future. We know that automation is fundamentally going to transform the nature of work for men and women everywhere. What do we mean by automation? So, my mental model as we were undertaking this research was a robot on a factory floor. But that's not this new world of automation that we're going to be in. Certainly there will be more robots on factory floors, but it's also about chatbots that you interact with when you call a call center. It's about virtual assistants like Alexa. It's an entirely new way of working with technology, which is fundamentally going to transform the lives of men and women everywhere. And the reason I was talking about these forms of technology is that automation is now not only going to be restricted to the world of manufacturing, it's also going to impact domains, sectors, occupations that women work in. And what our research finds is that there are going to be huge disruptions in the world of work for women. Looking forward to 2030, we find that 40 to 160 million women are going to have to switch occupations by 2030. That's 1 in 4 women on that high end of 160 million women, up to 1 in 4 women who need to switch occupations by 2030. Think about that. I mean, imagine the number of people in this room, how many of us are going to be impacted by this changing world of work. Now remember that that number for men also looks quite similar. So in some sense, men and women are running the same race. Up to 1 in 4 men could also be impacted by automation. But the distinction is that while they may be running that same race, women are running that race with a weight around their ankles. All the long-established barriers that I talked to are also going to impact how they can step into this new world of work. So I want to leave you with one thought before handing over to Quaylin, is why do we care about automation and how it's going to impact women? In some sense, the story around automation has been quite a doom and gloom story when you read how people talk about automation. But what our work finds is that there's 2 possible futures you could imagine in this new future of work. There's one future where women make these transitions successfully, and that leads us to a world where we have better paid, more productive, more fulfilling work, because people are going to be spending less time doing just basic, quite boring tasks like doing data entry, for example, right? So we could imagine a world of work where women are more fulfilled, but if they don't make those transitions, what our research finds is that women could be stuck in low-wage jobs. There could be competition for low-wage jobs that could put additional pressure on wages. And in many instances, women may drop out of the workforce entirely. So in some sense, we have these 2 futures, and it's up to us to shape which of these futures we step into. Automation and its impact is not a given, it's a choice. So I think the question I would like to leave us with and hand over to Quaylin is, which future of work for women do we want to choose for ourselves? Thank you.
Mikela painted a picture for you of gender equality on a global basis, as well as the impact of automation as we look ahead, so as we look out over the next 10 years. I want to give you a quick Cliff Notes version of what is the world of work today, and how do women and men participate differently in that workplace? Where are the pinch points across that pipeline? And these are the highlights from our partnership with Women in the Workplace. It's been a 4-year partnership where we've benchmarked across North America about 280 companies, representing over 13 million employees. So it's the largest benchmarking of its kind. And I'll just share the quick highlights as we give a backdrop for you for the panel, given you have some amazing women leaders, but also some pretty large employers as well who are going to share their perspectives. So what are the facts in terms of the pipeline? The pipeline across North American Fortune 1000 companies starts at about 48% women at the entry level. It then drops by 10 percentage points to 38% at that first manager promotion. And then it drops a few percentage points at every level, all the way down to 22% at that C-suite. So direct reports to the CEO, 22% of them, or 1 in 5, are women. And you might think, wow, 48% at the entry level, that's pretty good, right? That's almost 50%. But keep in mind that today, 57% of college degrees, in the United States at least, go to women. Women are the majority of valedictorians, salutatorians, higher average GPAs. If Fortune 1000 companies were getting their fair share of talent, there is no reason why that entry level of 48% shouldn't be 57% or more. The second key thing to remember is at that first dropping point of that first manager promotion, that 10 percentage point drop that I described, after that kind of a drop, there are a lot of levers, and I'm sure that you'll hear about some of them today, that we can pull to try to make that pipeline more even, but we can never catch up after that big of a drop. So you can do what you can to make it less unequal, but there's no recovering after that point. At that first manager promotion, if you index men's promotions to 100, women are 20% less likely to get promoted at that first level, and black women in the United States are 40% less likely to get promoted. So there's a huge gap. And if you look at that funnel overall, women of color, which in our study is black, Latina, and Asian women added together, start at about 17% of that funnel and drop all the way down to 4% at the C-suite. Literally 4% of people who report to the CEO in the United States across the Fortune 1000 are black, Latina, and Asian women added together. And when we first saw that data, we thought something must be wrong with the data. Let's go check it. And we checked it many, many times, and unfortunately it is true. It was 3%, it has inched up to 4%, but it is dismal and a very, very leaky funnel. There's also another element in that 22% of C-suite people who report to the CEO of, the 22% a little bit belies the balance of power there, because women are much more likely to have staff roles than line roles, right? They're much more likely, they're the majority of CHROs, CFOs, CIOs even, and less likely to own the largest P&L in the business. And when you look across S&P 500 CEOs who are promoted from within, every year, 99 to 100% of them are promoted from running the biggest business unit or the second biggest business unit to CEO. So if we want to shift the 5 now inching towards 6% of Fortune 500 CEOs who are women, we have to change this mix between staff roles and line roles over time. We also looked at women versus men and how they negotiate for themselves. And literally within 1 year, I think Sheryl Sandberg went on a lean-in tour, and the gap between women and men negotiating for themselves for salary, raises, roles, all sorts of things, closed. It's the fastest gap I've ever seen close. That's the good news. The bad news was that when women negotiate for themselves, they are much more likely to hear feedback of, you're too bossy, you're too aggressive, I don't like how selfish you are. And by the way, they hear this feedback from men and women. You're also less likely as a woman, and we asked this both of the managers and the women and the men on their teams, to get substantive support from your manager, help navigating politics, defending your work when it's challenged. So there is a gap between men and women kind of reporting that they get support from their managers. And women are also less likely to get tough feedback. And when we ask managers why, right, because you've got mixed teams, why are you giving tough feedback to the men and not to the women? And they say, number one, I'm afraid of an emotional reaction, and I don't want to appear mean. But when you compound that over somebody's career, and I'm not hearing the feedback of, Quaylen, here's what you need to learn to run the business, I'm not going to be able to grow at the same rates, and so we have to more proactively ask for that feedback in order to grow. The last 2 things I'll leave you with is unconscious bias, and in some cases, conscious bias. And what we know about resumes today is you can do the closest thing to a scientific experiment. So I can give you exactly identical resumes down to the font size, the font type, the exact bullet points that I share. In John Doe versus Jane Doe, both men, and again, the kicker, also women, ascribe much greater leadership and potential to imaginary John Doe right? So all of the societally embedded biases coming to play here. And should Jane Doe list active PTA member, which in the United States is sort of parent-teacher association, signaling you are a very active parent, 80% plus less likely to get called in for an interview, again by men and women, right? Because of all of the assumptions that we put on how they're prioritizing work and home. And should John Doe be compared to Jamal Doe? That's worth 8 years of experience. And Jamal Doe in the States is more of a traditionally African-American name. It's worth 8 years of experience and 50% less likely to get called in for an interview. And John Doe versus Muhammad Doe would be 3 or 4 times less likely to get called in for an interview. And all of this is in the context of we are all saying we care about diversity. I can't find any qualified candidates. Show me the qualified candidates. And they are there staring us in the face, and our bias doesn't allow us to see it. The last point I will leave you with before we open it up to our panel is this double shift and the concept of women working and then going home and having a real double shift. And this is true even as women progress across those levels of seniority that we were describing before. A senior woman working in the workplace is much more likely to be part of a dual income couple than a man at that same level. So for instance, across all levels, we asked women and men, do you do all or most of the housework in your family? 54% of the women said yes, and 22% of the men said yes. And this is even true when they are the primary breadwinner. So when they make the majority of income for their family, 43% of women continue to do all or most of the housework at home, and only 12% of the men. And so those gaps continue even when they are primary breadwinners. So hopefully that gives you a very quick sampling, but a bit of a fact base across what is the workplace that many of us encounter, and how is it unequal, and what are the things that we can change. I want to introduce to you our esteemed moderator, Raj Kumar. He's the president and editor-in-chief at DevEx, and he's also the author of a new book called The Business of Changing the World.
Thank you so much, Quay Lin. And I'll ask the rest of the panelists to please come and join us on stage so we can get started. I'm worried these chairs might get taken if we wait any longer. I was partly surprised to see the number of people who wanted to get in this room. I barely made it in myself. But also, it makes a lot of sense. This is a report, a serious report, but it's a follow-up to probably the most famous report in the world of women's economic empowerment. That $12 trillion figure that Mikela and Quay Lin both mentioned has been utilized by everybody in probably every panel since 2015 on this topic. And actually, what's interesting about that $12 trillion figure, it's the low estimate in that report. Yeah, it's kind of the base case. The high estimate, if we really took advantage of the opportunity, was 28 trillion. Now, this report, listening to the statistics you just laid out, Quay Lin, was pretty startling. I mean, these are things we know, but my one quibble with that report, just looking through the executive summary of it, was it talked about the rationale you and your colleagues at McKinsey Global Institute used to write it, and basically said, this is something we're all talking about. But my impression is we're not talking about this. There's lots of journalism and conversation about the robots are coming and what will automation mean. But the impact on women in particular, I think, is really underreported and really underdiscussed. Congratulations on producing a report that I think, hopefully, as you can see in this room, will start to really drive that discussion. So we've got an incredible panel of people across kind of every issue that were laid out by Michele and Quay Lin that relate to this. And we want to have a rich discussion and hopefully include all of you in it too, about how do we get from the stark figures we just heard to a different reality. And we're going to talk about things like supply chain. We're going to talk about things like gendered roles, about things like unpaid work. We're going to go across the spectrum. And I wanted to start with Gita. I'm sorry, I'm standing right in front of you. Let me see if I can find a better spot here on the stage. But Gita Rao Gupta, I think, is known to everybody in this room, probably from your long career in development at UNICEF, now at the UN Foundation, leading an initiative in India called 3D, which is an integrated approach to women's development in Pune in India. So you see this from many perspectives. So I thought maybe you could start us off with a take on, in a way, none of these issues are really new. Right? These gaps we've been talking about have been around forever. Maybe the difference is the urgency, that the changes we're talking about are by 2030, that we're in the midst of a rapid disruption in the work really all of us do, but in the world. So how do we even begin to think about tackling a challenge as big as what Quay Lin laid out for us?
So I have to say that, sorry. I have to say that the urgency has been urgent for more than 3 decades at least.
Yeah.
Because in a way, none of the data that was presented is new in terms of women's disadvantage in entry, in the conditions of work, and in exiting work as well. So those facts have been around. I think what's been missing is the action to address them through policies and programs, because a lot of it has been often put down to that's the way the norms are, that's the culture, women are expected to work at home, they must bear the childbearing responsibilities, that's what our culture says. And none of those are seen as being fixable through policies and programs. And I think what we know now through data from many, many experiments and scaled up interventions across the world is that in fact that can be fixed. That there is a way to introduce policies, take parental leave, for example, and giving women and men the opportunity to stay home with the baby. Even that, when it was first introduced, men didn't take advantage of it because they knew that if they did, they'd lose out in terms of their career ladder, whereas women did. And so in some countries, in one of the Nordic countries, it was made compulsory that if you didn't take it, you'd lose it. And then the dynamic began to change. So all I'm trying to explain here is there are various ways in which we can switch what we consider to be an immutable normative context, because in fact nothing is immutable. Change occurs all the time. Norms get negotiated and resisted on an everyday basis by individuals, and certainly governments and UN agencies and other big powerful players can play a role in making that happen. So we can get into the details of which specific policies.
Well, and businesses will play a really big role in driving that forward. So I want to bring Salima Espinel into the discussion. Salima is Vice President for Global Public Policy and Government Affairs at Starbucks. And Starbucks touches this issue in 2 ways. You've got all of your many thousands of employees around the world working in Starbucks locations, and then the supply chain. Largely women farmers, right, producing coffee and tea products. So how do you see this issue of automation that is probably going to dramatically transform your industry?
Yeah, it's been really interesting for us. So we are, just in the United States, our partner base, and this is what we call all employees who work for Starbucks because they all have stock in the company, is 68% women and 46%, I believe, minority people of color. So for us...
And how many partners are there? How many employees are
there?
there?
So about 200,000 in the United States, about 350,000 globally. And that's not even including the partners that we work with, the critical partners, the coffee farmers in the fields, as well as everything else that goes into the supply chain. So it's a huge number of people. And for us, we are very much focused on that connection in the store, that what we call the third place, and creating a welcoming environment. We know people come back for that connection with their barista. So what does that mean for us? And I think that is why we have been, we were one of the first companies to provide comprehensive health care to all employees, including employees just working 20 hours a week. And I think this is a fundamental point for us to think about, which is as we move towards more automation and a gig economy, people may want that flexibility, but they need the benefits. So all of our benefits, we have a full college tuition for a 4-year degree for all partners, healthcare, paid leave, parental leave, sick time. That all applies to partners who are just working 20 hours a week. And we have seen that as a real differential for us, and that obviously helps women in particular stay in the workforce and then provide that sort of ladder for them of opportunity. And then in terms of coffee farmers, we are seeing more female cooperatives in countries around the world. Frankly, in some countries that have been experiencing crisis. So we screened a film here called Hingakawa about an all-female coffee cooperative in Rwanda. And in Rwanda, 75% of the male population was decimated after the genocide or imprisoned. So it is critical for the economies of these countries that women are involved. And so how do you create that opportunity for them, and what does that mean? So that is something that we look to do both on the supply chain side and with our partners.
A big part of that opportunity, I want to get Sarah into the conversation too, is around financial inclusion, right? Because you think about those women farmers in Rwanda and elsewhere, how do we get them to be part of the broader new economy? And what the report talks about is the digital divide that we know exists today in a big way is going to get exacerbated because of the pace of change. So Sarah Hendricks, who's the Director of Gender Equality at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I'd love to get your take on how do we better include, especially women in the supply chain, women at the level of agriculture, at farmers, through financial inclusion, which is one of the huge opportunities we're talking about at Women Deliver this week.
Yeah, thanks so much. Certainly, as we started out embarking on building a strategy on women's economic empowerment, actually partnering with McKinsey in understanding the database and the fact base of what are the entry points to drive women's economic empowerment outcomes, financial inclusion shone pretty bright in terms of holding tremendous potential. What we know is that the gender gap is pretty persistent. It stands at about 9% between men and women, with women losing. Particularly in terms of mobile money.
I mean, the gap is getting worse.
The gap is stagnant. In some countries, it's getting worse. Between 2014 and 2017, we see some countries getting worse in significant ways. For example, in Bangladesh, the gap went from 9 to 29%. In Pakistan, a similar big drop. So the secular trends aren't necessarily meaning that women are catching up. Even as more women onload and access a mobile money account, more men are doing the same, even more men. And so women are being left behind. Now, I think what's important is to reflect on what does that mean in an automated economy. If you don't have a bank account, which is such a fundamental tool to your economic livelihood, and if you don't have a mobile money account, which is such a fundamental tool to your integration with markets, to being able to access price transparency, access buyer linkages, to get your products to market, you are left even more behind. And so closing that digital financial inclusion gender gap feels all the more pressing and urgent, particularly in the age of an automated economy.
And it's a great example of where the kind of economic lens and the societal lens have to come together. I was speaking to a telecom executive. You mentioned Pakistan and Bangladesh having declining numbers.
Correct.
This telecom executive is for a huge telecom company that's operating in India. And he was saying they looked at their numbers and saw a big gap, and they thought, oh, this is an easy thing to solve. We're seeing too few young women using our product. So we're going to have sales, promotions, discounts. We're going to do advertising. Like, we can close this gap. We do this everywhere. And they went after it and found it wasn't working. They weren't actually closing the gap, and so they ultimately, employ the kind of people who are in this room who do social science research and went out and talked to families and talked to adolescent girls and found out they weren't allowed to use the product. Correct. It wasn't a price question necessarily, or when they did get the product and took advantage of the sale or promotion, it was taken away and used by another member of the family. So these are cultural issues, these are societal issues, but they have a huge economic impact. So let's continue on this thread of supply chain. Elizabeth Vasquez, WeConnect, you're CEO and co-founder there. I think the companies that are part of your coalition represent like $1 trillion in buying power around the world. These are huge brand name corporations. I think one is sitting next to you. And so the statistics here, not to just depress everybody with terrible statistics, but they're pretty bad on the supply chain in terms of the percentage of women-owned businesses that are part of supply chains for huge corporations. Give us a flavor of where they are today and how this automation change is going to influence this picture.
So these are all great questions, and it's so fantastic to finally have some really good data backing up what we see every day. We're now working with women-owned businesses based in 115 countries, and we know that there are women out there who are unbelievably entrepreneurial, more so in places like Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, I've found, than the women business owners we're working with in the UK, Germany, Netherlands, and Switzerland, and France, which is interesting. So whether out of necessity or passion, they are starting businesses. They're just not scaling the businesses. They're thinking about low cost to entry, but not high profit potential into the sectors. And we find that women tend to focus on employing people. They're very human-centered design in the companies that they start and build. But the challenge with that is if men tend to automate, they tend to be able to reach scale faster. So the question is, how do we find the best of the models? Because if you're a country like India and your #1 challenge is employment, you need SMEs that create jobs for people, and women are really good at that. And so it's an interesting environment in which we know that these things are coming, and we need women to be at the center of building the solutions and not just using the technologies that the men decide for all of us. And I think and recognize that women in entrepreneurship, that's not going to be something unusual, that everyone is going to be going in and out of having a job, being a part of the gig economy, or having some other type of business, taking some time off, caring for not just children, but in the caring economy. So the reality is, no one goes into this anymore, especially the people that are graduating and entering the workforce. They're not going into this thinking they're going to have a job for life. And so that's a good thing and a bad thing. That's everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, what you said in the beginning there made a lot of sense to me. It resonated, but I'd love to hear an example. Like, you're saying that women in the supply chain, they're coming into the low barrier to entry businesses, which makes sense, but those are probably the most competitive because low barrier to entry, so there must be lots of people who they're competing with. And you said the low profit potential businesses, the ones that are harder to scale. Give us some examples. Where do you see an over-index of women entrepreneurs because of these discriminatory factors in the economy?
So we've had conversations, a lot of us, in women in agriculture. It's a really great example where women work the land, but they don't own the land. They don't own the businesses. They don't own the means of production. They rent the land or they rent the buildings, but we have a lease. We rent the equipment, but we don't own the equipment. It's fundamental. If we want to reach the SDGs and have poverty alleviation by 2030 and equality, there is no way that is going to be achieved if women don't start to own the assets. And it's really hard to build wealth if you don't have it in the first place. And entrepreneurship isn't the solution, but I promise you, if we don't get it right on entrepreneurship, we're not going to be able to do the rest of it. And those women are going to create jobs for the people who can't or don't want to be entrepreneurs. So it's important, these conversations that are happening, and thank you for always telling the stories about it.
Thanks. Carolyn, your platform is massive. Carolyn Tested is the president of Procter & Gamble in North America, the largest part of the Procter & Gamble business, I think $30 billion in annual revenue that you're responsible for. Couldn't help but listen to the earlier comments from Quaylin saying, I think it was Mikela who said that the women who become CEO one day typically run the largest business units of their business. Well, Carolyn happens to run the largest business unit at Procter & Gamble. So, Procter & Gamble touches from a couple lenses. One is the fact that you're advertising. We're all pretty familiar with the advertising you do, which hits directly on gendered roles. I think there's a Pampers commercial out there where you show men changing diapers. There's commercials around laundry detergent that show men doing the laundry. I mean, these shouldn't be very radical ideas, but they kind of are when you actually look at the statistics, as we just heard. So talk to us about that, how you're working to change through your business, through your products, change the way we think about these gendered roles.
Thanks, Raj. We have the privilege of having a large base, to your point. We talk to 5 billion consumers every year. We have brands that are meaningful to them. We have many brands that are made uniquely for women. And so we are committed to use our advertising to tackle bias and really to promote equality of all kinds, but certainly gender equality is front and center. And we do that through a number of different ways. We do that by, exactly as you said, just portraying men as equal partners, whether they're changing diapers or Swiffering floors or doing dishes. Those are really important pieces. Or whether we're actually tackling an issue with equal pay with Secret, toxic masculinity with Gillette, or even inadvertently taking on an issue. When we launched Ariel Share the Load, Ariel's a laundry detergent, we launched Share the Load in India, and it was really all about creating a new narrative that really encourages men to share the load. In India, 70% of girls and boys believe that housework is women's work. And so we made an entire campaign about that. We're on version 2.0, 3.0 in some countries. And what happened coming out of that was an organic movement where more than 2 million men signed a petition to say, we're going to share the load. We didn't instigate it, we didn't initiate it, it was just something that happened organically. And so I think it's a great proof point that says advertising has the opportunity to become part of popular culture. When you reach billions of people every day with your messages, you can change mindset, and that's really what we're looking to do with our advertising.
And I think you're the largest advertising buyer in the world,
We are.
Is that right?
Yes.
But it's still unique. Like, I saw a lot of people nodding about the Gillette ads, which we've probably seen. You're still kind of an outlier when I think about what advertising is like in general. And when we're listening to the statistics in this report, the urgency behind changing gendered roles is pretty extreme. Do you see a movement that these will not be so unusual? The work
we
you're
spend
doing?
a lot of time working with the Association of National Advertisers, the ANA in the US. We spend a lot of time working with our partners, including competitors, to really push more people into this direction. We do see this as a common agenda, not a competitive agenda. It's really important for us to do that. We won't change the world without it. And advertising is one of the ways that we can do it, but to Kwe Lin's points and some of the notions of the bias that exists within the workplace, there's also a tremendous amount that we can do as private industry and as business to really tackle the bias that's in the workplace. The bias is all based on false narratives that exist, right? And you talked so many of them even in your opening comments. The notion that what we tend to do is label women as less than or lacking because we compare their behavior to a prototype, a stereotype, a very outdated stereotype that's based and rooted in male behavior. And then if we get to women of color, that continues the path because we compare them as less than and lacking just because it shows up as different. And so we have to tackle the bias in the workplace as well. Advertising helps us talk to the people in our communities, they help us shape that, but there's also a responsibility that businesses have to tackle the bias in the workplace and to get rid of these false narratives, right? Women lack confidence, women lack ambition, all wrong, period. Women, need to be the primary caregiver at home. If you take a look at Generation Z and millennials under 30, they want to be equal partners in home. You can't have equality at work without equality at home. STEM is a guy thing. Women aren't as good at math or tech. Wrong again. But again, we don't have enough women doing that because we're not encouraging girls to study it. There's so many places where private and public partnership can influence and drive a change in the workplace, and we're committed to doing that as well.
I think the statistic is only 22% of people working in artificial intelligence today, which is a big part of the future. We heard about Alexa as maybe more the model we should have in mind rather than the factory robot. Only 22% are women. So I want to get you in on that topic, but I think you want to jump in, Geeta, please.
I just wanted to jump in to say, I think the point you're making, Carolyn, is also that in doing that, there's also benefit to the bottom line.
Absolutely.
And that's an important point to make, I think, because this is not altruistic only. These are great social goals, but they do make a difference to the profit margin. And I also want to underscore that that the power of media and advertising and marketing to change social norms is massive. Yeah. And so if you can actually get other corporate partners with you to do this, and I understand UN Women actually has an alliance called Unstereotype Alliance, and I think P&G is a member of that. And if there's a way to get a movement of people in society calling for more corporates to participate in those kinds of initiatives, because they have a double bottom line in a sense, that would be fabulous, because that can impact the social normative context enormously.
But what's amazing is that we're taught that markets are rational and they're efficient. And so if that were true, and there's this profitable opportunity in getting more women into business and more women into STEM careers and changing the nature of the workforce, why isn't there a stampede? Why isn't Wall Street and every investor stampeding in this direction? A lot of the conversation, Kwe Lin, that we hear in the tech world, which I know you work in at McKinsey, is around universal basic income. Like, that's the solution. Everybody's going to lose their jobs. Some people will be living on Mars, and the rest of us will have to get a paycheck from the government. It feels like this report is pointing us in a somewhat different direction. It's saying there's actually some public policy changes we can make that are not about just a universal basic income, but that will change the nature of the workforce and the economy. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I'd love to hear others jump in on that same theme.
Absolutely. I think at the scale that Mikela was describing of up to 1 in 4 women needing to change occupations and up to 1 in 4 men, this is up to 160 million women right around the world. At that scale, even employers at the level of Starbucks and P&G aren't going to get us there. And so unless governments are going to act in partnership with employers that I think are taking some really proactive, creative actions, and also with NGOs, many of whom are in this room, I think we're not going to be able to help women make that transition successfully.
So I absolutely agree, and I think one of the things that we have been focusing on a lot is pay equity. So for the last 2 years, we have talked publicly about reaching 100% pay equity for both men and women and individuals of all races in the US. And that is something that I think is been really significant for our partners, just to not only to do the work, but also to talk about it publicly in terms of, it's not advertising, but it is having that narrative conversation conversation about a public policy issue. We, recognizing that the gender disparity is even worse globally, now have a global goal of reaching gender pay equity in all of our company-owned markets around the world, and we announced reaching that in China and Canada this year. So one thing that has been really interesting about that is we've had many, many other companies come to us and say, tell us about talking about that publicly and the work, because it's a very complicated issue. If somebody leaves the company, that number changes. It's a milestone, but it's a muscle that you have to continually exercise and put resources behind. So it's not an easy issue to just sort of talk about. But we then joined the steering committee for the Employers for Pay Equity Coalition, and this year, with a number of other companies, announced some pay equity principles and came out and signed a letter with a number of other companies as partners. And we have seen that really be helpful in terms of moving the public narrative and just having these conversations about why pay equity matters, why is it complex, what does it do for your workforce and your bottom line. So seeing that and having that partnership has been really, really effective for us, and it's one way we can work with others on moving the public policy
I think
issue.
one thing this report is telling us is that pay equity is a very important issue, but another important issue related to it is just what is the base pay? Because if we're going to see larger numbers of people, especially women, at those competing for those lower wage jobs, there's going to be wage pressure in a downward direction, right? What's your, go ahead, please, Sarah. Yeah.
So I'm going to bring a perspective that is fundamentally in the global south, where the disproportionate number of women are actually still working in the informal economy. So they're not receiving a paycheck. And yet they are fundamentally contributing to the economic growth of not only their home and society, but also their country. And here I want to go back to Elizabeth's point previously, which is the ag sector. In some countries, for example, in Tanzania, 71% of all economically active women actually work in the ag sector. In Ethiopia, nearby in East Africa, that percentage is 59% of all economically active women are working in the ag sector. The question is, they're participating in a sector, but are they actually capturing equitable value from that sector? And the answer is absolutely no. The differential in terms of income is vast. In Nigeria, it's 50%. They earn 50% less than their male counterparts. This is DHS data. Trend lines over four.
Is that because the roles are different, or they're just
you got it?
Yeah.
So in part, it's because they comprise lower skilled, informal, and less well-paid members of the agricultural sector. And so we've got two major questions that strike me in the era of automation and as we go forward. Number one, as economies strengthen, as agricultural transformation takes place, you actually naturally will find, and it's an emblem of success, women moving out of ag and into service and industry. The question is, in automation, is that going to enable women at the same pace as men to move into service and industry? Secondly, when you look at women in ag, how can automation actually equip women to gain greater opportunities with more skilled labor in the ag sector? And we're really thinking about this at the Gates Foundation. We're thinking about women who work in ag and how could their roles be upskilled so that they actually start to work more in the agri-processing industry, so that they actually are gaining value, both in terms of income as well as productivity, at the same rates as their male counterparts. And currently that's not happening. And some of it, as Elizabeth has said, has to do with what assets and wealth you have, what access to inputs like fertilizer you have, what access, frankly, to information and skilling, as well as I said before, just price transparency and your pure linkages to buyers. All of those things have major gaps. Most notably, however, are the gaps in time and in mobility. In some countries where you see women disproportionately working in ag, they work 28% more of their day than men in unpaid care and domestic work, and they're constrained in terms of their mobility. So how are they going to access those markets with those high time as well as constraints of mobility that persist in their lives?
Geeta, maybe can you talk to us a little bit? I wanted to hear your take on some of the solutions on the agricultural sector, but just quickly on mobility. What does that mean exactly for women? Why is that such a big challenge?
Well, the biggest challenge with mobility is safety. There's firstly very little investment made in infrastructure in the areas where that benefit women. So if you look at the investments that governments make in roads, they're usually in highways. They're not in the roads that take women from village to a market. And then the transportation on those roads, I work in Pune, the Maharashtra State Transport Corporation, is totally unreliable in its services for women, even for students going to school. And it's unsafe. So the harassment on buses, on trains, on the platform, that public safety element is almost nobody's business, because the accountability in a public space at each point, there's a different person responsible. So when you're on the platform, the accountability is someone else's than when you're on the train. It's different when you get off at the other end and walk through the city. And at every point, if you map what women and girls consider to be hot spots in either rural areas or urban areas, you'll be astonished by the number of red dots where they think it's unsafe for them to travel alone. So if that's such a fundamental problem, how are they going to get to work if work is far away? So immediately then they choose work that's informal work, that's closer to home, that they can do at home, and that's usually contract work, piecemeal work, not covered by any kind of labor benefits, where they can't unionize, and so no bargaining power. Right. So many disadvantages all around. If your mobility is threatened by safety concerns, you take routes that in fact take longer to get to where you want to go, because you just can't afford to be, at risk. So this is a huge issue as well.
Okay, we got a few people want to jump in. Carolyn and Elizabeth.
Just a request out to the private sector. I do think this is where the private sector, in private and public partnership, can have an impact. And it has to start with a deep, deep commitment to equality and to advancing women in the workplace. And two examples of this. One is in India. We were very determined in one of our plants in Hyderabad, India, to make sure that we increased the opportunities for women. But it was illegal for women to work the night shift. And so using, again, the power of the private sector's voice and our voice and the influence that we had with local government, we managed to change the regulation, and we have 30% of our staff in that warehouse women. But again, it takes effort and it takes conviction and it takes a little bit of extra effort. We have the same thing from a safety standpoint, where in many cases within our sales organization, we wanted to increase the number of women, but there were safety concerns, so we hired drivers for them. Now, you can talk about that as, is that an extra cost? It's still the right thing to do. And so there are things the private sector can do uniquely, and you have to step into that and stand up as an example, because I think this is so critically important for our world.
Elizabeth?
I was more interested in the issue of the double burden, because it's a huge issue, right? We contribute massively to the global economy. It would collapse if we suddenly decided to stop doing the volunteer work. But in all seriousness, but think about that. We choose, or the environment encourages us, or sometimes makes us do free work all the time. At some point, half the population has to decide that doesn't work for us anymore, and we have to stop doing that. I'm being serious. So we need to think about the value of our time. It doesn't mean that our husbands have to start paying us. I'm just saying that we apparently control some $20 trillion in annual purchasing power. We decide how our families spend at the consumer level, how we spend our money. Let's start paying each other for the services that we provide to each other. So if we spend 10% of it with women, that's $2 trillion, because too often I think we wait around for a government policy, we wait around for the big corporates to fix stuff, but at some point we have to recognize we're very powerful. We have a lot of purchasing power, so let's just start paying each other, stop doing so much of the volunteer work, and I think we can change things like instantly.
I love your idea. I want to think about it in the context of some of the points that were made in the report around the potential in a future, more increasingly automated economy, what that means for heightened flexibility and new work locations that actually could work in women's favor. So yes, fully agree. one of the R's for addressing unpaid care work is reduce it, right? So let's just stop doing it. Another one is let's redistribute it and let's recognize it. Acknowledging all that, how does this new automated economy actually help work in favor of women to reduce, redistribute, and recognize unpaid care and domestic labor? And I'm actually hopeful that in an automated economy, we may see some heightened potential for women to both work from home, to have increasing opportunities for flexible arrangements. That's not the answer to everything, but I do think it brings more potential for women to participate in an economy through those channels.
The washing machine fundamentally freed up hundreds of hours of time. So we don't have to fear it, right? But we have to help build it to make sure it works for us.
But also we have to have the conditions in place to make that advantageous for us. It has the potential to, but if you don't have the right policy environment, it may not be. So flexible work is great, but the automation requires higher skill. If girls are not trained in those skills, they're not going to be able to take advantage of the flexibility that automation offers. So there are steps to that, and STEM education and girls being underrepresented in STEM education is a big one, right? So how do you, in where I work right now, I see lots of corporations in India providing job skilling programs, as they're called, actually training kids in sort of developing those skills. But the problem is that rural girls cannot benefit from those urban programs because most of them are in urban centers. The corporations who run them want to show a high retention rate, want to show a high recruitment rate, and a high job placement rate. All of that is much easier when you recruit urban kids, right? So for rural girls who go through lots of hurdles to get to secondary school and college, the few who do, the parents complain, well, after all that investment, there are no jobs for them that pay enough. And so what can we do, and what are the hurdles to that? Is that how do they get from the rural areas where they live to the urban centers where job skilling programs are happening? Well, why can't job skilling programs happen in rural areas? And for what kinds of jobs? Maybe for agribusiness, maybe for the smaller kinds of industries that exist in rural areas. But CSR money, corporate money must begin to think like that because there is a potential labor pool that exists in rural India at the moment, for example, that's not at all being tapped.
I want to go to everyone out in the audience here to contribute to the discussion, but just before we do, so start getting ready with your comments or questions. Before we do, I want to think through some more solutions, right? Because one way we could walk away from the session and this report is to say, this is very grim. In many areas, things are getting worse, and we don't know exactly what this uncertain automated world is going to mean. I think it was Mikela who said we're running a race with stones tied around or weights tied around our ankles, right? That's not going to get us to where we want to go. Is there a way? And we've heard a few solutions already: public-private partnerships, the importance of government investing in some areas where only government can, things like infrastructure and roads. We've heard about women acting as consumers, thoughtful, proactive consumers to say, I'm going to invest in the right kinds of businesses run by women. I'm going to pay other women for their work. We've heard about companies that are leading on paying women for their work and providing the kind of flexible arrangements. Are there other big picture ideas for how do we get from here to there, given the urgency of these issues? Salima?
So I think one thing that's sort of basic but fundamental is having systemic procedures in place in organizations and in companies to make that change. So not just pay equity, but also having targets for senior leadership. Because if you are represented at senior leadership, I mean, it's a basic but fundamental point, that will change the decisions that the company makes. We have a very diverse board of directors. We have a CEO who's a woman. And that translates into how the company operates and what kind of policies we're looking at. So it's not only younger women in their careers seeing that they are reflected in the C-suite, but also saying, okay, we've got goals and we do have specific goals, but where are we on that? And being transparent about it when we don't hit them, and having that kind of measure of accountability. So when you're public about it, you will have your employees and your customers coming to you and saying, where are you on this? And we published a civil rights assessment in January that went through all of our diversity initiatives and where we are, and we have very specific targets out there. And I think it's been incredibly helpful as a framework for the company to look across not just how do we become more diverse and inclusive across all of our business components, but it's that transparency and accountability that helps you keep all of this moving. So I think one of sort of the key messages here is to be very systemic about how you're approaching the work.
There's another policy issue that we haven't talked about, which is childcare and early childhood education. So opening more preschool possibilities for children, childcare services near places of work or near key transportation hubs are critical ways in which you can enable women to participate in the economy.
And that whole industry itself could create real opportunities for women entrepreneurs.
And
the whole caring industry.
women for what they provide.
Outsource some of it, not all of it, but some of it.
We talked, too, at this point about really working to make sure that we're being intentional in talent planning. And I think having the appropriate targets, and targets are one thing, but the intentionality with the talent planning to make sure that we're making very specific steps is really important. We've talked about equality-based policies. How do we think not only about pay equity, but sufficient paid maternity leave, paternity leave, parenting leave, eradicating harassment or workplace violence in any form. All of these things are part of equality-based policies. And then, as I was mentioning earlier, we have got to get the bias out of the workplace and broaden our definition of leadership so that we don't define leaders as a very specific stereotype. If you think about the workplace and the workforce of not only tomorrow in the automated workforce, but today, we need agile leaders. We need non-hierarchical leaders. We need highly collaborative leaders. That's what today's workforce needs. That's how we get more work done. And that will play to a different type of leadership, and that's part of what we have to drive for.
Thank you for that. And as might be obvious, in addition to her executive role at P&G, she leads equality across the entire organization. I want to turn to all of you. Push us. Are there issues we're missing? I've got a hand here and two over there. I think, is there anyone with a microphone that can go? Or I'll come to you if not. All right, let's see. And I'll just ask you to keep it relatively brief because there are a lot of hands, and tell us who you are.
Hi, my name is Anne Delorme. I'm with l'ACOSI, the Quebec Association of NGOs. I was wondering if we could speak to solutions around not just paying women for the work that they do, but paying them properly. So we've been pushing women to go into these higher paying fields and jobs, which is great, but how about the fields where women are actually paying them well so that we attract men and it becomes more fair? So I was wondering if you could speak to solutions on that across the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take a few at a time. I think you were first here. I'm going to run around to you. We'll do this. We'll make this work. I might break a sweat in this panel, but it's all right.
First of all, thank you all for being here. It's quite a panel of sheroes. And thank you, Michele, for your great intro. My name is Ali Solomon. I'm the gender specialist at the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. We have an agriculture program where we work on transitioning smallholder tobacco farmers to alternative livelihoods. And something that I've really struggled with in my work is the female tobacco farmers are, of course, at the bottom of the value chain. They're the most disadvantaged node. And then being women, of course, they don't have the resources that they need. Elizabeth, as you mentioned, they don't own anything. They just work the land. And something that I've struggled with, and we talked about, cross-sectoral partnerships, public-private partnerships, getting the NGO work in there as well. It's really difficult for me to convince people to work in the tobacco value chain and upgrade it to support the women that are already there. Of course, ideally, there would be no tobacco value chain, and therefore women would not be stuck in it. So my question for you all is, how do we encourage people to work across sectors with the women that are trapped in these problematic value chains? Because they're, not to call anyone out, but it's really difficult for me to get like USAID on the phone to be like, how are you working with the tobacco companies in Malawi so that the women aren't left behind? So my question for you all and my challenge for everyone in the audience is, how do we make this truly an inclusive future and not leave anyone behind? They need our help.
I think we have one more here. We're going to start with these first three. Excuse me.
Thanks so much. So my name is Helen. I work for a global non-for-profit called Student Energy, and we work with 50,000 young people in over 120 countries to develop leadership capacities, to lead on clean energy, the clean energy transition, but also clean energy access. And of course, future of work is very front of mind for us. We work with 18 to 30-year-olds. So my question for you is, thinking of young people as solutions for reaching our gender equality goals, what are some of the key capacities that we as nonprofits working to educate young people around the world, what are the key capacities we should be building in these young people in order to push this agenda forward?
Thank you. So I think Anne and Helen's questions really tie well together. Anne was asking, for women who are in industries that may not pay well, rather than thinking about the new industry they can go to, how do we just get them to be paid more now? And Helen's saying, what are some of the skills we would give those women to get them into higher paying jobs in the future? Anybody want to try to tackle those related points to get us started? Go ahead, Elizabeth. Yeah.
So follow the money. I mean, so often I see women who start businesses or go into a job because it's an easy thing to do. They know someone there that can hire them, or they know how to bake something. But at some point, if we want to have wealth transformation and we want to change business models, the way we build our communities and our businesses and our governments, we have to think about what is it the world needs and what is it the world will be willing to pay for. And a lot of them are really good things that people need. We talked about outsourcing, kind of joking about that, but in all seriousness, if women are really good at the care economy, there's a lot of money in that. Just go to Japan. Like, they really, really need women who are good in the care economy, and they're happy to pay a lot of yen. So I think we just need to rethink, like, what is the value, what is it the world is going to need, and position ourselves to be at the forefront of designing that.
I think you just added immigration to the list of policy questions we need to talk about. Go ahead, Sarah.
I think there's an opportunity as well for women to think about collectivization. We often think about the single individual entrepreneur and the way in which she either needs to upskill or gain more opportunities for enhanced pay. But when women come together and are able to negotiate better linkages with buyers, or able to leverage opportunities for procurement policies within their own country, they can do that by working together. At the Gates Foundation, we work with self-help groups in India that comprise between 68 and 70 million women. These are groups of women who have and could have great potential by coming together as collectives, collective entrepreneurs, that could interface with the economy in new ways and could drive up income and their income leverage and value capture from the work that they do. So I think we also need to break apart how we think about the entrepreneur.
That sounds like a solution for the Malawian women farmers. If they get together, they can just raise the price of their tobacco product.
Hey, listen, I lived in Malawi for many, many years. I have watched and stood beside those Malawian tobacco farmers. I have sat in the economy of Malawi and watched how that single day on the tobacco floor makes all the difference. And it is really hard in the context of an environment where we want the tobacco industry to frankly tank out, and you've got women whose entire livelihoods depend on it. And I don't think there's an easy answer there. But I do think what you're calling our attention to is to be creative and to be bold and to not let those women get left behind as industry either rightfully or wrongfully changes. And how can we think about those women who are already on the margins of one of the poorest countries in the world, actually enable them to have opportunities in new ways?
We got a great op-ed on exactly that point on DevX. I recommend to all of you. Go ahead, Salima.
So this is not a complete solve for the issue that you're talking about in terms of tobacco, but just one perspective on this. Working in Colombia in particular, we have seen a lot of farmers trying to transition, including female farmers, and I was speaking with one a couple of years ago when we were down there, from producing coca to producing coffee. And so obviously there's a great incentive for them. There has been to produce cocoa. That is an economy for them, to your point. So for us, looking at that and looking at, we buy 3% of the world's coffee and premium coffee. We are always looking at ways to invest in our farmers and our female farmers so that they will stay producing high quality coffee. So we have done a number of things, including loans, but also we have a farmer support center there that brings together agronomists to open source. You don't need to sell to Starbucks, but just to create, how do you make this transition and how do you make it in a way that is profitable for the farmers, because there's going to have to be upfront cost investments. So how do we help them transition to a new economy when the economy that they're in right now is so profitable for them? So that's one way of thinking about, like, how do we help transition them out? But it's complex, and we've certainly seen that challenge around the world.
Now, as we wrap up, because we just have a couple of minutes left, I want to hear from all of you if there's any final thought you've got on how do we get the urgency behind this. Report's going to go out. I hopefully, like the last Power of Parity report, it gets picked up and used in many panels around the world on these issues. How do we make sure it turns into action? Geeta, any thoughts?
This is... the action part is always the tough part, because fundamentally the way the world works right now with this inequality between women and men has served a few and disadvantaged some. And so the point is, it's a power imbalance. And to shift that power imbalance is going to take that kind of evidence about the economic value of shifting that power balance, because there's power in money. So making that case more might create the incentive one hopes, but also accountability and organizing and mobilizing. I mean, I come from the civil society world, and I'll tell you that the more we organize and mobilize and call for change, and can do that from the grassroots up. That's why I'm perpetually calling for more money to be given to civil society organizations, because they do that best. Because the biggest transformations that we've seen in women's status and in gender equality have been because of civil society action over the last 3 decades. So I would say that's where we begin. We organize and make the case and get that kind of data to make the economic case for it, even though we hate to do that because it's a women's right to be equal. But we have to make the instrumentalist economic case in order to make people in power listen.
Yeah, the status quo exists for a reason. That's why it's so hard to change it. And that includes...
And markets are gender unequal and are very gender biased.
Absolutely. Any other final thoughts from anyone on the panel? Sarah, go ahead.
Sure. 2 very quick thoughts. One is a challenge to all of us in the room. So often in our organizational planning, we look 3 years forward, sometimes 5. We all know that. We build results frameworks around programs. We do strategy planning that often hits around the 3 to 5 year mark. We've got to start building that muscle that looks at the trend lines 20 and 30 years from hence. And we've got to base that on data that needs to stay fresh and consistently provided. If we don't start changing our approach to how we plan in development, I fear we will come up surprised in the ways in which women aren't winning in a new automated economy. So I'd like to challenge us all to do trend-based future planning as we think about our own strategies and projects. The next thing that I'd say is, let's not forget the laws and policies right now that are so discriminatory and are holding some of the poorest women back from work. Women, Business, and the Law report provides a really clear overview of the number of economies out there that constrain women's mobility to work, constrain women from working in certain sectors, constrain women in terms of sexual harassment policies that are not available at work. Let's start taking those kinds of constraining policies and laws and actually changing them so that women are supported in work right now.
Just for the private sector, just to link to this, we should all continue to work on these policies, but for the private sector and for business, we have an opportunity to lead in this space and accelerate progress, because we can do things without waiting for a mandate from government, without waiting for legislation, just because it's the right thing to do. And so to private sector, act with intention, act with intentionality, lead, because we can.
And I would add to that, and as consumers, require that from the companies that you're buying from and that you support. Have that expectation and be insistent and continue to have that conversation and hold us to that standard.
You said voting. We literally vote for the world we want every single day. It's in how you spend your money. Buy from the people you care about. Doesn't have to be just women, people with disabilities, LGBT, ethnic minorities, whatever it is that those communities that are underutilized, underengaged, we need them desperately because their solutions are going to help all of us. And we're all going to be better off if we all, work together. And so be very conscious every day about how you spend your money. Spend it with corporations that are conscious, organizations, governments, but we all have this ability on just a simple day-to-day basis to have a massive, massive collective impact. And use the data. Read the report and actually do something with it.
Any final thoughts from you, Quaylen?
I think this panel is just the perfect combination of using your money voting, but voting every day, but also this cross-sector partnership that I think is really going to help us accelerate progress, because we're going to need it.
The big upside of a moment like this, of disruption, when things are changing really fast, is it gives us a chance to shape that future. Right? It can seem like the status quo has just always been this way and it will not change, but we're going to go through dramatic change in just the next few years. I just came back from a trip to Rwanda where I was visiting Zipline. I'm not sure how many people know Zipline. I'm sure at least a few here in this room, but it's their drone delivery system for blood in Rwanda. They started in Rwanda, and I was really pleased to see as I went and looked at the room where they build the batteries and where they assemble the drones, real gender disparity, gender equality. Women were developing these drones, were managing the systems that fly the drones. And you see that, and that's now $1 billion company. It's a unicorn. They're spreading around the world. This stuff is coming quick. So if we can get it right, we can use our voices, why Women Deliver in a moment like this is so important, to actually shape the world we want to see. So please join me in congratulating McKinsey Global Institute for the report and thanking this fantastic panel.